you are dealing with what you might flatteringly call the most sophisticated electorate in the world, which is in some ways a very unreliable one. We don't know yet.
Sophisticated euphemism for devious.
Yes, and it's the usual one used in these circumstances, sure. The question is whether this sophisticated or devious audience, as you prefer, thinks only Boris Johnson can get us out of this. Only he can restore the name that we're losing for reliability. Only he can change the weather and do something different. Or whether they don't accept that and decide to do something else.
We're going to come back to the scenarios, Stephen, of what, say, Boris or another leader might actually do over Brexit. But just in terms of how Labour views these candidates and views of Boris' candidacy and others, who's the biggest threat from their point of view? Who worries them?
So it kind of depends. So within the kind of, the inner circle, there you get two opinions. You get the people who say the problem is someone like Boris Johnson, or they don't expect someone like Jacob Rees-Mogg, but someone who can take some of that reputation for authenticity that made Corbyn so appealing last time around and can blunt that distinctiveness. And then some of them, and it essentially comes down to the divide within Corbyn's inner circle. Some believe that what's happened is politics has polarised between the left and the right, and a candidate who is a strong representative of the other pole is damaging to them. Some of them think that what's happened is politics has moved to the left, and therefore a Conservative candidate from the party's left is what is dangerous to them. So someone like Jeremy Hunt, who might mean that people who want to vote Green or want to vote Liberal Democrat feel able to go on holiday from voting for the Labour Party, not just in a second order election like the Euros or the councils, but in a general election. So there are really two great strains of thought. Then among Corbyn sceptics on the backbenches, they essentially still think that what happened last time was an election in which people thought Jeremy Corbyn could not become Prime Minister, meant that people could vote on whether or not they wanted Theresa May to have a big majority or no majority. And in an election like the next one, when there will be a real possibility of Corbyn becoming Prime Minister, it doesn't really matter who the Conservatives put forward, because in an election in which Corbyn could win, the election everyone expected to happen in 2017 will play out regardless of who the Tory candidate is.
Which do you think is right, or neither?
I mean, the kind of fun thing for all of us, right, is that there are several plausible theories about 2017, and one way or the other, the next election is probably going to test that. From a kind of scientific perspective, I think that's why Boris Johnson would be the most interesting candidate, because it is the kind of let's refight the 2017 strategy of the Conservatives becoming the party of Brexit and Brexit only, to see if you can win Bishop Auckland but not lose Putney. Is the kind of Boris question. Someone like Jeremy Hunt, of course, is kind of the let's see if we can recreate the Cameron coalition. But we don't know, right? That's the fun thing.
And will Boris actually live up to that kind of persona, or will he play it completely differently, Paul? Because when you talk to people around him, it sounds as though the plan is to subvert the genre a bit and revert to Boris Johnson, One Nation Toryism, try and get everybody to forget some of the other bits of recent branding. How would he play it?
In some ways, Stephen just used the language of science. In some ways, politics is a sort of science. You can study marginal seats, voting patterns, who goes one way and who goes the other. But in other ways, it's more like an art form. Someone emerges and catches the imagination in a way you didn't expect, as Corbyn did in 2017, at least up to a point. So the question about Boris Johnson is, does he catch the public imagination and repair some of the damage to the Conservative share of the vote that's kicked in over the last few months? Or do the voters decide that somehow he's kind of not a serious person and can't be trusted to govern properly? And the answer, of course, is we don't know. I mean, what he clearly is trying to do is to pick up support among Conservative MPs right across the range. Because if he can do that and get through to the last two, he will probably win. I think there's a slight danger for him here in that his base is the Brexiteer vote, but he has a reputation for unreliability. And if the Brexiteer MPs, the kind of ERG mass of about 100, think somehow that he's preparing some sort of second referendum or Norway-type dodge, their support will go elsewhere, and he could just find himself falling between two stools. Or he picks up support from everyone and his momentum becomes unstoppable.
So one of the great suspicions, as you allude there, is that Boris Johnson will actually turn around and maybe Nixon to China style be the guy who actually tries to push through Theresa May's deal, or ends up going for a second referendum. Would you bet against that?
I mean, I wouldn't put any money against that, not least because, the argument people around Philip Lee were making when he first came out for a second referendum is we can't have an election while Brexit is unresolved. This Parliament can't resolve Brexit. Therefore, we've got to do a second referendum. That calculation probably remains pretty unimpeachable. The only politician who I can plausibly imagine becoming Conservative leader who has the credibility to carry that move off is Boris Johnson. The tactical argument for it remains unchanged.
So then the Tory party becomes the party of no deal, potentially. Let's assume it's a referendum on you're assuming then no deal versus Remain.
Yeah.
Rather than him having conjured a deal with Brussels. We'll park that one for another day because there's an awful lot of scepticism around whether he can really negotiate some of the stuff that's sometimes his supporters say can be negotiated.
The other logical place for this to end is not with a referendum, but with a general election. So you go through the summer, he makes some changes, he comes back with his new policy, which is a more no-deal flavoured sort of policy, doesn't get anywhere with Brussels, can't get it through the Commons because, as so many people have said quite correctly, the numbers in the Commons don't change. At that point, a general election becomes possible.
He's a man who's wanted to be Prime Minister since he was an embryo. I mean, is he really going to roll the dice after 4 months in the building?
Well, in which case he will be faced with the likely alternative of sitting there until, like Theresa May, he falls.
Or the second referendum.
Or the second referendum. You can't survive in a stasis. You have to do A or B. But a second referendum would be even more difficult at present with Tory MPs than a general election. And of course, they are very wary of the former. So he would really have to change their minds just through the magic, as it were, of having this reputation as a Brexiteer. I'm not sure he can do that.
The other thesis is that, and it's put around again by a lot of people who support Boris Johnson, is that he's not going to have to worry about any of these things because there are no bits of legislation to stop him coming out on no deal, upon which people who want to stop it in Parliament, the Yvette Coopers of this world, can hang anything, and he can sail happily towards that Jerusalem.
I'm a bit sceptical of that because we've heard that already. Once already, no deal couldn't happen, and it's just not taking a number of things into account. Sure, no deal is possible, not least because it's imaginable that the EU loses patience with the UK, I suppose, and I'm not sure they would shaft the Irish. But you're not dealing with a known here. So, for example, this study today is saying the new leader, the new Boris Johnson type Prime Minister could get round it. You're not taking account of what the Speaker might or might not do, and the Speaker does have extraordinary power to decide what the Commons can and can't vote on, as we've seen.
I think so. So technically, of course, you can just prorogue until the 31st of October and leave without a deal. But even the advocates of no deal talk of a managed no deal where you would have to pass necessary bits of legislation in order to deal with the effects of leaving without a negotiated accord.
Protecting the rights of EU citizens, perhaps.
And the second you have any bit of legislation with the word EU no deal preparation on the floor of the House of Commons, that no deal majority asserts itself. I think, parking for a moment, I think the idea that you have a managed no deal and that works out fine is a little bit for the birds. But the idea that anyone would go, what I really want to do is to sit there in the executive, not passing any of the laws to tackle a no deal exit and just have it happen on the 1st of November, I just don't really think that's possible.
Of course, we've been discussing Boris Johnson doing the unexpected and the unknown, so you have to entertain, if it is him, the possibility of him doing that. But it would be a huge political crisis were he to do so, which is why I keep coming back to saying that logically, insofar as logic counts for anything here, one's heading towards a referendum or an election, and I think on balance the form as more likely. By the way, there's of course a big wrinkle here in the Tory leadership contest, which is Tory MPs won't want to be told that. Right.
No, it'll be the great unspoken thing of the whole campaign. Everyone will be dodging it.
Yeah, if you go to see Boris Johnson, you go, Boris, give me your word you won't call an election. And as I say that, right, I'm speaking aloud here about what they would think rather than what they would say. They would be thinking, but we can't rely on your word necessarily. And Theresa May promised us she wouldn't call one, and she did.
So if we go into that, let's pursue that scenario. You could have Boris Johnson putting no deal versus Remain to the country in a second referendum, sometime potentially, maybe even later this year, assuming no extension. Is there a danger for the Tory party if you are defined as no deal versus Remain, and Labour by then might have more embraced the Remain label? Is that actually going to be a good place to be in the medium term for the Conservative Party?
I'm sorry to keep going on about an election, but that's one of the reasons why I think it is possible that Boris Johnson or whoever could go down that route rather than the referendum route, because in an election, sure, you'd have some renegotiation policy with no deal backing it up, but if you won, it's a very, very big if, you would have changed the numbers. Whereas, if he tries to do a referendum on this very difficult basis, he might not get the bill through the Commons to do it. You know, it needs a bill. Getting a referendum bill through this Commons, a difficult thing to do.
Stephen, what do you think goes through Labour minds at the moment in terms of the prospect of a referendum under Boris Johnson, no deal versus Remain?
Well, I think there are a variety of Labour views on this. There are the people for whom, they've already had the one nightmare, which was the polling card arriving for European elections 3 years after we voted to leave, who will try and move heaven and earth to avoid a polling card with the words referendum on the European question landing on people's doormats. And can they, together with the Conservative rebels we know that there will be, block it passing or neuter it in some way? Very possible. Equally, you have people who think that it's a failure of representative democracy to put no deal and the prospect of the chaos that would cause to a public vote, and would seek to amend it out so you have some kind of withdrawal agreement versus no Brexit at all. Would that amendment then pass? Possibly. Would that majority then sustain itself? It's hard to say for certain. I think that is kind of the difficulty, is that usually we're being asked to predict between a series of likely and unlikely outcomes, whereas all of these outcomes are so unlikely, but something will happen, right?
We're all hedging because when it's a bill, right, bills can be amended. What's the bill proposing? What's the nature of the referendum? This Commons doesn't like no deal. So an attempt to take no deal off the referendum table might succeed. What's the franchise going to be? Are European citizens going to be allowed to vote? Will 16-year-olds be allowed to vote? You can see getting a bill through without peculiar alliances joining to quash it might be very difficult.
We seem to be pretty much agreed that with Theresa May's departure, which may have happened by the time people are listening to this, or that she's announced her intention to go, and the contest has started and all the rest of it, one of the branches of the sort of decision tree falls off, the one that had deal on it. I mean, you're not serious, nobody's seriously thinking that is revived under the sort of person who's going to win the Tory leadership contest. And we then have the other branches. So the ones we've talked about, referendum, general election, and one we haven't talked about, revoke.
So I think I'm not convinced that the deal branch of the decision tree does drop off. I mean, so the thesis that a minister put to me yesterday, which I thought was quite persuasive, is that the big thing that Theresa May going changes is, at the moment, talking about the loss of the majority is like speaking about an awkward family argument, because the person who crashed the car is by definition not well placed to say we've all got to get out and walk. Whereas the danger, I suspect, to Boris Johnson, to Dominic Raab, to any of these people who it is hard to see how they can get what they want with this House of Commons, is does it allow someone who is more sort of moderate on the Brexit issue to say, look, we have to accept that due to an electoral event beyond our control, we have a flavour of Brexit we don't like, but we can grit our teeth, deliver it, and move on to other things, and then we can revisit Brexit when we have our own majority to do Brexit in our preferred way. I wouldn't rule out the ability in a long contest, seeing as YouGov polls of party members are intensely reliable, and it's very interesting to me that a majority of Conservative members want a no-deal Brexit, but they also want to avoid a general election. And it is not, I think, beyond the wit of a skilled politician to point out that thanks to Theresa May's mishandling of the last election, and once she's gone, the kind of statute of limitations on slagging off her handling of it will evaporate. Thanks to her mishandling of the last election, you've sort of got to swallow a deal you don't like in order to avoid an early election, which has a heavy possibility of a Corbyn-led government.
Obviously, in a Tory leadership election, there is the space for someone, as it were, to try to outright the other candidate by promising no deal outright. But I'm not sure that'll happen for this reason. I suppose Theresa May did introduce this bill. She's still there, introduces it, it's voted down. That's the end of the withdrawal agreement. But if she goes and the bill is never put, the withdrawal agreement is still floating around. And it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab or Graham Brady, perfect name to choose in this instance, could say, we will forward the withdrawal agreement, we're not going to drop it. But I'm going to build on it by putting a 2020 end date in for the backstop that's in the unilateral declaration. Or one of these candidates could say, we're picking up the withdrawal agreement, but we're going to go for the good old Brady amendment and take the backstop out of it. So I'm not actually sure the withdrawal agreement is completely dead and that you're going to have the candidates just fighting on the basis of
it might be dead as an agreement with a capital A, and that there won't be anyone to sign it on the other side of the channel.
Well, we're talking about what happens in a leadership election, yeah? I'm simply saying that if you're postulating the candidates all round, or mostly on a no-deal platform, I think using the withdrawal agreement in some way as part of a platform, even if it won't necessarily work with the EU, is quite likely.
Yes, but it's not realistic. It's camouflage, isn't it?
Not necessarily. I think if you put the 2020 date in, the 2020 date was in the unilateral declaration, the EU didn't object to that. And indeed, as I understand it, that's meant to be in the bill. Now, whether or not a candidate standing on that sort of basis could beat someone who's arguing for no deal outright, I don't know. But all I'm saying is it's not necessarily the case that the withdrawal agreement is dead as an instrument of policy or as something the candidates will stand on in the election.
Does it? We didn't get touch on revoke there. Do you think there's any chance that this Parliament, if we were to be at the brink of a no-deal moment, would press that button? It doesn't feel like the votes are there for that option, does it, Steve?
No, I think... So it once felt plausible, and you can see how at the point of the cliff, this Parliament could generate a majority to just revoke. I think the lesson that MPs have taken, rightly or wrongly, from the extension in March is that the EU will never push the UK out, and you can always defer the decision later. So I think it is much more likely than there would be a Commons majority for a last-minute extension. I mean, that is the joke I keep hearing in Whitehall, and we'll actually have a Turkey Brexit. Is Turkey still joining the EU? Technically. Do we think it will ever join? No. Is the United Kingdom still leaving the EU? Possibly. The circumstances are quite similar.
In an imaginary world, I don't think this will happen, but I suppose it's possible that in October the EU does lose patience and decides not to extend further. I think that's very unlikely, because I don't think the EU will dump Ireland in it in that way, and this is something that some people here have underestimated throughout. But let's just suppose for a moment that they did. The Commons would then have the choice, wouldn't it, to either seek to revoke or go for no deal. Honestly, I have to sort of shrug my shoulders with a certain amount of humility that's been beaten into me rather than is there naturally, and just say, I don't know. I don't know what the Commons would do under those circumstances. I mean, 3 or 4 months ago, I just said it'll revoke. Now, with Farage stampeding around with the European elections, I do not know what it would do if that came to the crunch, which I think it won't on the whole.
I'm sure we're all drenched in humility after the last few years, but Stephen, that having been said, I'm going to ask you to make another prediction now. The other side of these European election results, what sort of trouble, if any, is Jeremy Corbyn in?
In terms of his position as Labour leader, none at all. Partly because if Labour members get disillusioned with Jeremy Corbyn, they leave. They cease to be a factor in the struggle for power. In terms of his path to Downing Street, I think the thing which would alarm me if I were sitting in Jeremy Corbyn's office is if the polls are to be believed, the rise of the smaller parties on either end of the Brexit polarity results in a hung parliament or with Labour as the biggest party or a small Labour majority. The signal that sends, right, is that if you are a disgruntled Remainer, it is safe for you to vote Green or Liberal Democrat without jeopardising getting shot of the Tories. Whereas the message, if you are a disgruntled Brexiteer, is it is not safe for you to vote for the Brexit Party in a general election. And I still think, and this is probably a deeply old-fashioned view that I will feel very embarrassed about in a couple of years, but I still think that when push comes to shove, people will not be so angry about this form of Brexit that they vote in a way that they know hugely increases the chances of a majority for the forces that want to stop Brexit entirely.
I'm quite interested in because I don't know the Labour Party, it's not my field, what Labour MPs in Northern and Midland seats who voted for a referendum recently in those indicative votes, what they will think if the Brexit Party does very well tomorrow. Because I sort of understand the rationale of those who favour a referendum, who've said, well, it's not like in the local elections our vote was disappearing off to hard right parties. It was going to Liberal Democrats and Greens and independents in lots of places. And of course, there's also the statistical fact, as I understand it, that most Labour voters in those seats were for Remain and not Leave. So I can see there's a sort of rationale for supporting a second referendum if you're a Labour MP and you don't like Brexit. What I don't have a sense of, and Stephen, I hope will, is how someone in that situation will react when or if Farage does exceptionally well tomorrow.
I think in some ways it will be a kind of Rorschach test. People will see what they want to. The ones who are already nervous about a second referendum will be more so. I think the thing that these European elections will almost certainly do is they will strengthen the hand and the voice of the kind of forgotten majority of people in the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is people who have a seat which either went Lib Dem in 2005 or 2010, or where they got quite a big fright in 2005 or 2010, and have never quite believed that the Liberal Democrats are dead, who know that the majority of their votes are for Remain. And the argument that you will hear sort of very impatiently from those people is they'll say, look, the reason why my colleagues in ex-industrial parts of this country have a problem is not Brexit, it's Corbyn. And you know, someone just says, I don't see why I should be at risk from a Liberal revival because some of my colleagues don't want to admit that we have a problem with our leader. So I think that one of the reasons why this result will entrench rather than solve the Brexit deadlock is the bit of the Labour Party which is worried about a second referendum is going to get a lot more panicked. But the bit which is worried about its angry Remainers is also going to look at those results and go, what are you talking about? We cannot be seen to facilitate Brexit. And the thing is, I think probably from a numerical perspective, they're both right. I actually don't think there is an electorally effective Brexit strategy for the Labour Party, beyond, you know, hope that social liberals start having lots of children who then age to maturity much quicker than we would expect.
Are the elections that are happening as we're sitting here going to turn out to be epoch-defining, or will politics ping back into shape like an elastic band, like it sometimes does after European elections?
Anyone answering that question is going to hedge and give the two arguments. And argument number one is, you know, look at the last few years. UKIP rose and then disappeared. David Cameron, master of all he surveyed, right, didn't lose two elections, won the AV referendum, won the Scottish referendum. Suddenly he's no more. Jeremy Corbyn, written off, comes from nowhere to about 40%. That argument would say, you can't write the Tories off, the situation is recoverable, and that Farage will once again fade as he once grew. I mean, another way of looking at it, and there's no way of knowing the answer to this until it happens, is that Theresa May has done something absolutely fundamental, which is Iraq, expenses, the crash, a sense that politicians don't do what they say, that she said 100 times we'd go on March 29th, didn't. She then said we should go in June, and we didn't. And she said European elections would be unacceptable, and we have them. And it's that I think, that sort of tipped the parliamentary party over the edge. And could it be the case that whoever the next Conservative Party leader is, the voters will turn around in a kind of simple but straightforward way and say, why should we believe you after the last one?
Quick last one to both of you about possible splits in the Labour Party. I mean, in the Conservative Party, there has been a split, a party that we could have been talking about, Change UK, but we're not, and I don't particularly intend to. But Stephen, do you think there could be a bigger split on the way in Labour, or the Change UK fortunes have stemmed that?
I think, yeah, the fact that there was a brief moment when why don't you go and join Change was not when it was called TRG, when it was not a punchline. And I think the possibility of either more people joining or a split to have a more avowedly centre-left force was quite likely. Given what's happened, given the strength of the Liberal Democrats who are also fishing in that same pool, I think it is quite unlikely, with the important proviso that because the rules have changed to make it much easier to deselect Labour MPs, it's one thing to say you love the Labour Party when you feel that the Labour Party, at least locally, might still love you. If you are a Labour MP and reselections come about and you do not make it, then maybe you will go, actually, I am going to try and set something new. Whether or not it will be any more successful than Change UK, who knows?
A brief political sunset home for some Labour MPs. We know Tory MPs have talked about how if Boris Johnson's the leader, I'm not hanging around for that. Maybe some of them mutter that they would vote no confidence in the government if it was led by Boris Johnson who's hurtling towards no deal. Is there a split
and
in
we're
prospect?
hearing much less about that now. And an earlier part of this conversation was all about whether Tory MPs on the left and centre of the party could vote for him, because there's lots of talk of them perhaps doing so. So, is there a relationship between that shift and the plight of Change UK? I kind of think there is. When Change UK first emerged, you couldn't quite know where it was going to go. The odds are always against a new force in a first-past-the-post system, but it seemed possible to imagine at some point it could be a vehicle for more than Heidi Allen and Sarah and Anna Soubry. I think now, to put it mildly, it doesn't look that way. So if you left the Tories, the place where you'd really have to go if you were not seeking to retire would be the Lib Dems, and that's still psychologically quite difficult, right? It's more difficult somehow for a left-of-centre Tory MP, more difficult for them to go to the Lib Dems, who you've fought in elections over and over again, even if they've been a coalition partner, and some brave new force that you might hope to shape.
Stephen, Paul, thank you both so much for giving up time at a very busy moment in politics. You can both now switch on your phone and see if we've got the same Prime Minister that we started with. Thank you very much indeed.